The great crystal towers of Zephyria Prime stretched toward the purple sky like fingers reaching for the stars. These beautiful structures had stood for thousands of years, their surfaces glowing with soft blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The light came from the life force of the Zephyrian people themselves, a peaceful race of tall, graceful beings with skin that shimmered like mother of pearl and long, flowing tentacles instead of hair. Ambassador Kelthara stood at the massive window of the council chamber, watching the city below with growing fear. The blue glow of the towers was changing. Thin veins of sickly green light were spreading through the crystal like poison through blood. Where the green light touched, the crystal began to turn black and crumble. "The infection spreads faster than we calculated," said military coordinator Vexhan as he approached her. His forearms moved nervously, adjusting the holographic displays that showed their world's condition. "The outer settlements have gone completely dark. No signals, no life readings, nothing." Kelthara turned from the window, her large silver eyes reflecting the council chamber's emergency lighting. Around them, dozens of Zephyrian officials worked frantically at their stations, trying to coordinate what remained of their defense forces. The air buzzed with tension and the rapid clicking sounds of their language when spoken under stress. "How many settlements have we lost?" she asked, though she feared the answer. 14 in the last cycle alone," Vexhan replied, his voice heavy with defeat. "The Void Swarm doesn't just destroy our cities. It consumes them completely, breaks down every molecule and rebuilds it into more of itself. Our people, our buildings, our very soil, everything becomes part of the swarm." The Void Swarm had appeared at the edge of their star system 3 rotations ago, emerging from the dark space between stars like a plague of mechanical locusts. The first reports described massive ships that looked like they were built from the bones of dead worlds, all sharp angles and twisted metal. These ships didn't attack with weapons in any traditional sense. Instead, they released clouds of tiny machines called nanites that ate through everything they touched. At first, the Zephyrian defense fleet had tried to fight back. Their ships were beautiful things, designed for exploration and peaceful contact with other species. They had weapons, but they were meant for defense against pirates or wild animals, not against an enemy that turned everything it touched into more weapons. The battle had been a disaster. The swarm ships absorbed the energy from Zephyrian weapons and used it to build more nanites. When the defenders tried to ram the enemy vessels, the mechanical swarm simply flowed around the attacking ships like water, then consumed them from the inside out. Within hours, half the defense fleet had been converted into swarm vessels. "What about the evacuation ships?" Kelthara asked, grasping for any hope. "Gone," Vexhan said quietly. "The swarm has learned to track our energy signatures. Every ship that tries to leave the system is hunted down and consumed before it can reach safe distance for a hyperspace jump." Kelthara closed her eyes and felt the weight of her entire species resting on her shoulders. She was not a military leader or a scientist. She was a diplomat, trained to solve problems with words and negotiation. But how do you negotiate with machines that see all life as nothing more than raw materials? "There is one option left," said an ancient voice from behind them. They turned to see Elder Morthek approaching, his old body moving slowly but with dignity. His skin had faded to a pale silver with age, and the tentacles around his head had grown long and thin. He was old enough to remember the early days of Zephyrian space travel, when they first made contact with other species among the stars. "Elder," Kelthara said respectfully, "what option do you speak of?" "The humans," Morthek said, and the word sent a chill through the chamber. Several younger Zephyrians gasped. Others made protective gestures with their hands. Everyone in the galaxy had heard stories about humans, though few had ever seen one. They were said to come from a world so dangerous that just living there had turned them into the most feared warriors in known space. "Elder, surely you don't mean—" Vexhan started to protest. "I mean exactly that. Morthek interrupted. I have lived long enough to hear the stories from traders and refugees. The humans are violent, yes. They are unpredictable and dangerous. But they are also the only species that has ever faced the Void Swarm and won. The stories say they are monsters, whispered one of the younger council members. They come from a death world where everything tries to kill everything else. They fight wars for sport and consider violence an art form. The stories also say, Morthek continued calmly, that they have something no other species possesses. When facing extinction, they have hope that burns so bright it becomes rage, and rage that burns so hot it becomes determination. They do not surrender. They do not retreat. They fight until either they win or nothing remains to fight with. Kelthara felt her hearts beating faster. The Zephyrians had always been a peaceful people. They solved conflicts through discussion and compromise. The idea of calling upon beings known for their violence went against everything they believed in. Even if we wanted to contact them, she said, how would we do it? The Galactic Council has strict rules about human contact. Most species are forbidden from even approaching their star system. Those rules exist for good reason, Vexhan added. The last species that tried to invade human space was the Krathani Empire. They sent a battle fleet of 200 ships. The humans sent back a single vessel carrying the Krathani Emperor's crown and a message that said, next time, send more ships. No one knows what happened to the Krathani fleet. Morthek moved to the central communication console, his old fingers, dancing over the controls with surprising skill. The rules exist to protect other species from humans. Yes, but they also exist to protect humans from the galaxy. The galactic government fears what would happen if humanity ever decided to expand beyond their small corner of space. What are you doing, Elder? Kelthara asked as warning lights began flashing on the console. I am preparing to send a message on the emergency frequencies, Morthek replied. A plea for help that will reach every inhabited system within 50 light years, including Sol, the human home system. Elder, if we do this, there is no taking it back, Vexhan warned. The humans might come, yes, but they might also decide we are weak and claim our world for themselves. We could be trading one destroyer for another. Morthek's ancient eyes looked out at the city, where more crystal towers were beginning to show the green infection of the swarm nanites. In the distance, they could see the dark shapes of converted Zephyrian ships moving through the atmosphere, spreading more nanites like seeds of destruction. Look around you, the Elder said sadly. In 20 rotations, maybe less, there will be no Zephyrian civilization left to protect. The swarm will have consumed our bodies, our culture, our very souls. Whatever the humans might do to us, it cannot be worse than total extinction. Kelthara made her decision. As ambassador, she had the authority to speak for her people in times of crisis. Send the message, Elder. Send it to everyone, including the humans. Tell them we are dying. Tell them we need help. Tell them... She paused, thinking of the right words. Tell them that if they can save us, we will owe them everything. Morthek nodded and began typing the message. As he worked, the chamber fell silent except for the soft humming of the communication array charging up. Outside, another crystal. Tower went dark as the swarm's infection reached its core. The message went out into space, traveling faster than light through the quantum communication network that connected civilized worlds. Most species that received it would offer sympathy, but little help. The Void Swarm was considered a force of nature, something to be fled from rather than fought. But in a small blue-green world orbiting a yellow star, the message would be received by beings who had never learned to accept the impossible. The message from the Zephyrians reached Earth on a Tuesday morning, though it had taken 6 months to cross the vast distance between stars. In the underground command center beneath the Rocky Mountains, Admiral Sarah Chen read the translated text for the 3rd time, her coffee growing cold as she processed what she was seeing. Admiral? Colonel Rodriguez stood in the doorway, holding a stack of preliminary reports. The analysis teams have finished their review of the alien transmission. Chen looked up from her tablet. She was a small woman with gray-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too many battles, but her voice carried the kind of authority that made grown Marines stand straighter. "Tell me what we're dealing with, Colonel." Rodriguez entered the room and activated the large holographic display. The image showed a three-dimensional map of local space, with Earth at the center and various alien civilizations marked in different colors. A pulsing red dot marked the Kepler 442 system, 47 light-years away. "The Zephyrians are a peaceful agricultural species," Rodriguez began. "They've been known to the galactic community for about 200 years. Clean record, no conflicts. Mostly keep to themselves. They trade food and art in exchange for technology they can't develop themselves. And now they're being wiped out by something called the Void Swarm," Chen said, standing up and walking closer to the display. "What do we know about this enemy?" "That's where it gets interesting, ma'am." Rodriguez touched a control, and the display changed to show grainy images captured by deep space monitoring stations. "The Void Swarm has hit 43 star systems. In the past 50 years, every single civilization they've encountered has been completely consumed. No survivors, no refugees, nothing left behind except empty space." Chen studied the images. The swarm ships looked like they had been built from the wreckage of 1,000 worlds, all twisted metal and sharp angles. They moved through space in loose formations that reminded her of wolf packs hunting prey. "How do they fight?" she asked. "They don't, in any conventional sense," Rodriguez replied. "They use nanotechnology to break down everything they touch and rebuild it into more of themselves. Enemy ships, asteroids, even space stations, everything becomes part of the swarm. Most species that encounter them try to run rather than fight." "Most species," Chen repeated thoughtfully. "But not all?" Rodriguez grinned, the expression of a predator recognizing worthy prey. "The Krex Confederacy tried to make a stand about 20 years ago. They had a strong military and good defensive positions. The swarm consumed their entire civilization in 3 weeks. Chen nodded slowly. She had spent her entire adult life preparing for this moment, though she hadn't known it at the time. Humanity had been expanding into space for over a century. Now, and every step of the way, they had encountered species that seemed surprised by human attitudes toward warfare. Most aliens, they had learned, viewed war as something to be avoided at all costs. When conflicts did arise, they were usually resolved quickly through negotiation or limited engagements that minimized casualties. The idea of total war, the complete dedication of a civilization's resources to destroying an enemy, was considered barbaric by galactic standards. Humans, of course, had been practicing total war for thousands of years before they ever left Earth. "What's the time frame?" Chen asked. "The swarm reached the edge of the Zephyrian system 3 days ago, local time. Based on their previous patterns, the Zephyrians have maybe 2 weeks before complete consumption." Chen walked back to her desk and pressed a button that connected her directly to the president. The conversation was brief and to the point. When she hung up, she turned back to Rodriguez with a smile that would have terrified most alien species. "Colonel, please notify Fleet Command that we are implementing War Plan Omega. All available ships are to assemble at Luna Station within 48 hours. Full war loadout, including the experimental weapons." Rodriguez's grin grew wider. "Ma'am, are you sure we want to reveal our full capabilities? The other galactic powers have been trying to figure out our military strength for decades." "Colonel," Chen said, as she began pulling up fleet deployment charts on her tablet, "in about 3 weeks, there's going to be a very public demonstration of exactly what happens when someone threatens our neighbors. I think it's time the galaxy learned what humans are really capable of when we put our minds to it." The news spread through the Terran Defense Forces like wildfire. In orbital shipyards around Earth and Mars, crews worked around the clock to prepare the most powerful fleet humanity had ever assembled. The backbone of the force was the new Olympus-class dreadnoughts, massive ships that carried enough firepower to crack a small moon. Supporting them were dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and the sleek black shapes of stealth ships that officially didn't exist. Captain Maria Santos stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Indomitable, watching the final preparations through the main view screen. Around her, Luna Station buzzed with activity as supply ships delivered ammunition, food, and replacement parts. The sight reminded her of the old stories her grandfather used to tell about the great naval bases during World War II, when humanity's survival had depended on ships and the brave souls who sailed them. "Captain," her communications officer called out, "we're receiving deployment orders from Admiral Chen." Santos read the orders quickly, then smiled. The Indomitable had been assigned to Battle Group Alpha, the spearhead formation that would hit the swarm hardest and fastest. It was exactly where she wanted to be. "All hands, this is the captain," she announced over the ship's intercom. "In 6 hours, we jump to the Kepler 442 system to engage an enemy that has destroyed 43 civilizations. The odds are not in our favor. The enemy outnumbers us and has technology we don't fully understand. By all reasonable military analysis, this should be a suicide mission." She paused, looking around the bridge at her crew. They were young men and women from every continent on Earth, united by their willingness to fight for something greater than themselves. "Fortunately," Santos continued, "humans have never been particularly reasonable. We come from a world that tried to kill us every single day for millions of years, and we're still here. We've survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, plagues, and wars that should have wiped us out. We've learned to turn our planet's attempts to murder us into advantages." In the Marine barracks, Sergeant Williams checked his squad's equipment one final time. The powered armor they wore was a masterpiece of human engineering, combining protection with mobility in ways that alien engineers claimed was impossible. The weapons they carried had been designed specifically for fighting the Void Swarm, based on captured nanite samples and theoretical models of how the enemy technology worked. "Remember," Williams told his Marines, "we're not just representing Earth out there. We're representing every human who ever looked at something impossible and decided to punch it in the face anyway. The swarm thinks it's unstoppable because it's never met anything stupid enough to keep fighting when the smart move would be to run." One of the younger Marines raised his hand. "Sergeant, what if the alien civilians get scared of us? I mean, we know what the other species say about humans." Williams grinned and shouldered his plasma rifle. "Son, after we're done with the Void Swarm, I don't think anyone's going to be worried about humans being too violent. They're going to be worried about what happens to species that don't have humans watching their backs." Admiral Chen stood in the main command center, surrounded by holographic displays showing the readiness status of every ship in the fleet. 37 vessels in total, from the massive dreadnoughts down to the fast attack craft that could slip between enemy formations like sharks through a school of fish. "Admiral," her chief of staff reported, "all ships report ready for departure. The fleet is assembled and waiting for your order." Chen looked around the command center one final time. These people, her people, were about to embark on a journey that would either save an entire civilization or result in the destruction of humanity's most powerful fleet. But as she watched her staff work with calm efficiency, she felt nothing but confidence. Humans had always been at their best when the stakes were highest. It was hardwired into their DNA, a legacy of evolving on a world where only the most adaptable and determined creatures survived. When faced with extinction, most species tried to negotiate or flee. Humans got angry, and angry humans were the most dangerous force in the known galaxy. "All ships," Chen announced into her headset. "This is Admiral Chen. We jump for Kepler 442 in 5 minutes. Remember, we're not just going to save the Zephyrians. We're going to send a message to every species in the galaxy. The message is simple. Earth protects its neighbors. She paused, looking at the tactical display one more time. And may whatever gods are still paying attention have mercy on anything that threatens what we protect. The Zephyrian defense fleet was dying by degrees, and Ambassador Kelthara could only watch helplessly as her people's beautiful ships were torn apart by an enemy that seemed to understand their technology better than they did themselves. From the command center, deep beneath Zephyria Prime's capital city, she observed the battle through sensors that showed her the systematic destruction of everything she had ever known. Another squadron lost, reported military coordinator Vex Han, his forearms moving frantically over his control panels. The graceful swimmer and her escorts just went dark. That's the last of our heavy cruisers. The main display showed the orbital battle in devastating detail. Zephyrian ships, elegant things that looked like living creatures swimming through space, were being surrounded and consumed by the mechanical nightmare of the Void Swarm. Where the alien nanites touched the hull of a defender ship, the metal began to change, twisting into new shapes that served the swarm's purposes. How long before they reached the surface? Kelthara asked, though she already knew the answer would not be good. At current rate of advancement, perhaps 6 hours, Vex Han replied quietly. The orbital defense platforms are holding them back, for now, but once those fall, he didn't need to finish. Everyone in the command center understood what would happen. The Void Swarm would descend on their world like a plague, consuming everything organic and inorganic alike. Within days, there would be nothing left of Zephyrian civilization except empty space and twisted metal, serving as raw material for the swarm's expansion. Elder Morthek sat in the corner of the command center, his ancient eyes closed as if in meditation. He had not spoken since sending out the distress call hours ago. Kelthara wondered if he was praying to the old gods, or simply trying to find peace in their final moments. Ambassador, one of the sensor technicians called out suddenly, I'm detecting massive energy signatures at the edge of the system. Multiple contacts jumping in from hyperspace. Kelthara felt her heart skip a beat. The Galactic Defense Force? Negative, ma'am. These signatures don't match any known ship designs in our database. Whatever they are, they're big and they're moving fast. The main display shifted to show the new arrivals. Kelthara gasped as she saw them, massive metal shapes that looked like they had been designed by someone who understood that space was a hostile environment and built accordingly. Unlike the graceful curves of Zephyrian vessels or the organic flowing lines favored by most galactic civilizations, these ships were all sharp angles and brutal efficiency. 37 vessels, the technician reported, his voice filled with awe. The largest ones are over 2 kilometers long. I've never seen anything like them. Vex Han was studying the tactical display with growing confusion. They're not slowing down, he observed. Standard protocol when entering a combat zone is to reduce speed and assess the situation. These ships are actually accelerating. As they watched, the unknown fleet formed into attack formations with mechanical precision. Unlike the loose, organic patterns used by most space navies, these formations looked like something designed by military engineers who had studied warfare as a science rather than an art. They're heading directly for the swarm core ships, the sensor technician reported. No communication attempts, no warning signals. They're going straight into battle. Kelthara found herself holding her breath as the unknown ships opened fire. The weapons they used were unlike anything in the Zephyrian database. Focused beams of energy that struck with pinpoint accuracy, kinetic projectiles that hit with the force of small asteroids, and missiles that seemed to track their targets through impossible maneuvers. By the eternal light, whispered Vex Han. Look at the damage readings. The first Void Swarm vessel to be hit simply exploded. Not damaged, not disabled. Completely destroyed in a chain reaction that lit up space like a newborn star. The mechanical, Precision with which the swarm had been consuming the Zephyrian fleet suddenly looked clumsy and inefficient compared to the devastating effectiveness of the newcomers. "They're humans," Elder Morthek said quietly, opening his ancient eyes. "I can feel it in the way they fight. No other species in the galaxy approaches warfare with such focused violence." Humans. Kelthara turned to stare at the old Zephyrian. "How can you be certain?" "Because they're not trying to communicate with the swarm," Morthek explained. "Every other species in the galaxy, when faced with the unknown, tries to establish dialogue first. Humans see an enemy, and their immediate response is to destroy it as efficiently as possible." As if to prove his point, one of the human ships, a sleek black vessel that barely showed up on sensors, appeared directly behind a swarm cruiser and unleashed a barrage of weapons fire at point-blank range. The swarm ship disintegrated under the assault, and the human vessel immediately disappeared again, presumably using some kind of stealth technology. "Their tactics," Vexahan observed with professional interest. "They're using the swarm's own behavior against them. The swarm adapts to threats by studying them and developing counters. But the humans keep changing their approach faster than the swarm can adapt." It was true. As Kelthara watched, she saw human ships switching between different weapon systems with each attack. Energy beams, kinetic projectiles, missile swarms, and even stranger weapons that seemed to bend space itself around their targets. Just when the swarm began to develop defenses against one type of attack, the humans would switch to something completely different. "They're not just fighting," she realized with growing amazement. "They're hunting. They're treating this like a predator stalking prey." One of the largest human ships, a massive dreadnought covered in weapon turrets, accelerated directly toward the swarm's primary command vessel. Kelthara expected to see it open fire at long range, following standard naval doctrine. Instead, the human ship continued its approach until it was almost touching the enemy vessel before unleashing a devastating broadside that tore the swarm ship in half. "That's insane," breathed one of the technicians. "They're fighting at ranges where any damage to their own ship would be catastrophic." "That's the point," Morthek said with something that might have been admiration in his voice. "They're willing to risk everything to ensure maximum damage to the enemy. Most species fight to minimize their own losses. Humans fight to maximize enemy casualties." The battle continued for hours, but the outcome became clear within the first 30 minutes. The Void Swarm, which had seemed unstoppable against every other opponent, was being systematically dismantled by an enemy that fought with a combination of technological superiority and tactical brilliance that bordered on art. Human Marines, in powered armor, launched themselves from torpedo tubes to board swarm vessels, planting explosive charges while fighting hand-to-hand combat against mechanical defenders. When human ships suffered critical damage, their crews would aim them at enemy vessels and detonate their power cores in controlled explosions that took multiple swarm ships with them. "They're magnificent," whispered Vexhan, watching a human destroyer sacrifice itself to destroy a swarm battleship. "And terrifying. I understand now why the galactic government restricts contact with them." Kelthara found herself torn between gratitude and fear. The humans were saving her people, but the casual way they dealt death was unlike anything she had ever witnessed. When a group of swarm fighters tried to escape the battle, human interceptors hunted them down with the patience of natural predators, destroying each one methodically before returning to the main engagement. "They don't take prisoners," she observed. "The Void Swarm doesn't offer surrender," Morthek replied. "The humans are simply responding in kind. They understand that some enemies cannot be reasoned with or reformed. They can only be destroyed." As the battle reached its climax, the largest human ship, a massive vessel that dwarfed even the swarm's command cruiser, moved into position at the center of the enemy formation. Energy readings from the ship spiked to levels that made the Zephyrian sensors scream warnings about overload. "What are they doing?" Kelthara asked. Something that will probably violate several galactic weapons treaties, Vexhan replied, studying the energy patterns. That looks like some kind of focused gravity weapon. The human dreadnought fired, and space itself seemed to scream. The beam that emerged from the ship's primary weapon struck the largest swarm vessel and simply erased it from existence, leaving behind nothing but expanding vapor and twisted metal. The gravitational shock wave from the weapon's firing spread outward, disabling every remaining swarm ship in the battle zone. In the sudden silence that followed, Kelthera realized that the Void Swarm, the unstoppable plague that had consumed 43 civilizations, had been completely destroyed. Not defeated, not driven off, but utterly annihilated by an enemy that had appeared out of nowhere and fought with a brutality that made the swarm's mechanical efficiency look gentle by comparison. "Incoming transmission," reported the communications officer. "It's from the human flagship." The main screen flickered, and for the first time, Kelthera found herself looking at a human being. Admiral Sarah Chen appeared to be a small, elderly female, but her eyes held a hardness that spoke of battles fought and won against impossible odds. The battle for the Kepler 442 system raged through the void like a symphony of destruction, and Captain Maria Santos had never heard anything more beautiful in her life. From the bridge of the heavy cruiser Indomitable, she watched her tactical display as human forces dismantled the Void Swarm with surgical precision and overwhelming firepower. "Captain," her weapons officer called out, "we've got a cluster of swarm fighters breaking formation. They're trying to flank Battle Group Charlie." Santos studied the tactical plot for exactly 3 seconds before making her decision. "Helm, bring us about bearing 27 Mark IV. Weapons, prepare a full spread of Hellfire missiles. Let's teach these machines what happens when they try to outmaneuver a species that invented fighter tactics." The Indomitable rotated smoothly in space, its massive bulk moving with the grace of a dancer despite being over 800 meters long. The human ship's designers had learned long ago that in space combat, mobility was often more important than armor. Better to avoid getting hit than to rely on taking punishment. "Missiles away," the weapons officer reported. "Time to target, 23 seconds. Santos watched as 24 missiles streaked across space toward the swarm fighters. Each missile carried an artificial intelligence that had been programmed with the combat experience of humanity's greatest fighter pilots. When the swarm tried to use their adaptive jamming technology, the missiles simply switched to backup guidance systems. When the enemy attempted evasive maneuvers, the AIs predicted their movements and adjusted course accordingly. "Direct hits. Across the board," the weapons officer announced with satisfaction. "Enemy fighters destroyed." "Outstanding," Santos replied, but her attention was already moving to the next threat. The main swarm fleet was trying to reform around their command vessel, a massive ship that looked like it had been built from the twisted wreckage of 100 different civilizations. "Helm, take us into the enemy formation. I want to get close, enough to see the expression on their sensors." Her bridge crew exchanged glances that mixed excitement with concern. Getting close to a swarm vessel was dangerous. Their nanite weapons could begin converting a ship's hull in seconds if they made contact. But Santos had studied the enemy's behavioral patterns during the approach to the system, and she had noticed something important. "Captain," her executive officer said carefully, "are you sure about this? Standard doctrine calls for engaging at maximum range to avoid nanite contamination." "Standard doctrine," Santos replied with a grin that would have made a shark proud, "is for species that haven't spent their entire evolutionary history learning to kill things that are bigger and stronger than they are. The swarm adapts to threats by studying them from a distance, but their adaptation protocols break down when they can't get clean sensor readings." The Indomitable accelerated toward the enemy formation, weaving between streams of nanite clouds that would have spelled doom for any ship they touched. Santos had served in the asteroid wars, where space battles were fought in 3 dimensions around tumbling rocks that could crush a ship if a pilot made one wrong move. Compared to threading the needle between colliding asteroids while enemy ships shot at her, avoiding nanite streams was almost relaxing. "In range for close attack weapons," the weapons officer reported. "Fire everything," Santos ordered. The Indomitable erupted in light and fury as every weapon system on the ship fired. Simultaneously, plasma cannons that could melt through asteroid-grade rock, kinetic kill vehicles that hit with the force of small meteors, and experimental gravity bombs that twisted space-time around their targets. The swarm command ship staggered under the assault, its adaptive armor struggling to cope with the variety of damage types. "Follow-up attack from port batteries," Santos commanded. "Don't give them time to adapt." This was the key to fighting the Void Swarm, she had realized. Their technology was incredibly advanced, but it relied on being able to analyze and counter enemy attacks. If you hit them with too many different types of weapons too quickly, their systems became overloaded trying to develop appropriate responses. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the battle zone, Sergeant Williams led his Marine boarding party through the twisted corridors of a captured swarm vessel. The humans had blasted their way inside through a hull breach, following standard boarding procedures that had been developed during the colony wars 50 years earlier. "Contact front," called Private Jackson, raising his plasma rifle as mechanical. Defenders emerged from the ship's walls. "Suppressing fire," Williams ordered, and his squad opened up with weapons that turned the corridor into a brief vision of hell. The swarm defenders were tough, but they had been designed to fight civilized species that followed the galactic conventions on warfare. They were not prepared for humans who had learned to fight in the tunnels of Mars and the zero-gravity battlefields around Jupiter's moons. "Advance by pairs," Williams commanded, falling back on training that was older than spaceflight itself. "Jackson and Martinez, move up. Chen and Rodriguez covering fire." The Marines moved through the ship like a pack of wolves, using tactics that combined thousands of years of ground combat experience with technology that let them fight in 3 dimensions. When the swarm tried to seal blast doors to stop them, the humans simply cut through the walls with portable fusion torches. When mechanical defenders tried to ambush them from above, the Marines used their suit thrusters to fight on the ceiling, just as effectively as on the floor. "Target acquired," Williams announced as they reached the ship's central processor core. "Jackson, set the charges. Everyone else, prepare for extraction." The nuclear device they planted was small by human standards, barely larger than a suitcase, but it was more than enough to turn the swarm vessel into an expanding cloud of superheated plasma. Williams and his team were already heading for their extraction point when the ship began to come apart around them. "Pick up in 30 seconds, came the voice of their pilot over the comm system. "Hope you boys had fun in there." "Always a pleasure." "To redecorate alien architecture," Williams replied as they reached the hull breach where their transport waited, especially when the previous owners were so rude about not surrendering. Back on the Indomitable, Captain Santos was watching the larger strategic picture develop. Admiral Chen had divided the human fleet into smaller task forces that struck at different parts of the swarm formation simultaneously. It was a risky strategy that required perfect coordination and split-second timing, but it was paying off in spectacular fashion. "Admiral Chen is signaling for the final phase," her communications officer reported. Santos felt her pulse quicken. The final phase of the attack plan was something that had been classified above her security level until just before the battle began. She knew it involved the dreadnought Olympus and its experimental primary weapon, but the details had been kept secret even from most of the fleet commanders. "All ships, clear the firing solution," came Admiral Chen's voice over the fleet communications network. "Olympus is preparing to engage the primary target." On her tactical display, Santos watched as every human ship in the system began moving, away from the swarm's command vessel. The massive enemy ship was still fighting, its weapon systems lashing out at nearby human vessels, but it was clearly doomed. Most of its escort fleet had been destroyed, and the nanite clouds that were its primary defense had been disrupted by sustained human attacks. The Olympus, humanity's newest and most powerful warship, moved into position with the slow majesty of a mountain coming to life. The dreadnought was over 2 kilometers long and bristled with more firepower than most planetary defense systems. But its primary weapon was something that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable under galactic warfare conventions. "Stellar lance charging," came the report from the Olympus. "All ships maintain minimum safe distance." Santos had read the technical specifications of the stellar lance during the trip to Kepler 442, though she still wasn't entirely sure she understood how it worked. The weapon used controlled gravity manipulation to create a focused beam that could, theoretically, crack a moon in half. It had never been tested against a live target before. "Stellar lance at full charge," the Olympus reported. "Target locked. Firing." Space itself seemed to convulse as the weapon discharged. The beam that lanced out from the human dreadnought was invisible to the naked eye, but its effects were immediately apparent. The swarm command vessel, which had been over 3 kilometers long and massed as much as a small asteroid, simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, fighting desperately against its attackers, and the next moment there was nothing but an expanding cloud of elementary particles. The gravitational shock wave from the weapons firing spread outward at the speed of light, and every remaining swarm vessel in the system simply stopped functioning. Without their command ship to coordinate them, the individual swarm units reverted to basic programming and began shutting down one by one. "All enemy contacts have gone dark," Santos's sensor operator reported, his voice filled with awe. "The swarm fleet is completely disabled." Santos leaned back in her command chair and allowed herself a moment to savor the victory. 3 days after the battle, Ambassador Kelthera stood in the docking bay of the human flagship Olympus, waiting to meet the beings who had saved her civilization. The massive ship was unlike anything in her experience, where Zephyrian vessels were designed to be beautiful and welcoming. The human dreadnought felt like being inside a weapon that had been built to intimidate as much as to fight. The corridors were wide enough to move heavy equipment at speed. The walls were covered with armor plating that could probably stop a meteor strike, and everything had the look of something that had been designed by military engineers who expected their ship to be shot at on a regular basis. Even the lighting was harsh and functional, casting sharp shadows that reminded her constantly that she was aboard a warship. "Ambassador," said the young human marine who was escorting her, "Admiral Chen will see you now." Kelethara followed the marine through corridors that bustled with activity. Human crew members moved with efficient purpose, maintaining equipment, analyzing battle data, and preparing for whatever mission might come next. She noticed that many of them wore small patches on their uniforms showing images of Earth, a blue-green world that looked deceptively peaceful from space. The Admiral's ready room was spartanly furnished, containing little more than a desk, several chairs, and a large view screen showing the slowly spinning bulk of Zephyria Prime. Admiral Chen rose as Kelthara entered, and the Zephyrian ambassador got her first close look at the human who had commanded the force that destroyed the Void Swarm. Sarah Chen was smaller than Kelthara had expected, and older, with gray streaking her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent making difficult decisions. But there was something in her gaze, a combination of intelligence, determination, and carefully controlled violence that made it clear why other species whispered about humans in fearful tones. "Ambassador Kelthara," Chen said, gesturing toward one of the chairs. "Please, sit down. I understand your people have questions about what happened here." Kelthara settled into the chair, which had been adjusted to accommodate her taller, more slender frame. "Admiral Chen, I have been authorized to speak for the Zephyrian Council in expressing our eternal gratitude for what you have done. Without your intervention, our civilization would have ceased to exist within days." Chen nodded, pouring herself a cup of coffee from a dispenser built into her desk. We received a distress call. We responded. That's what civilized species do, for each other. But why? Kelthera asked, leaning forward. Your species has a reputation throughout the galaxy. Most worlds consider humans to be dangerous. Too violent to trust, too unpredictable to ally with. The Galactic Council has strict protocols about contact with your people. Yet when we called for help, you came immediately and risked everything to save strangers. Chen was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee and looking out at the image of the Zephyrian homeworld. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had thought deeply about questions of duty and responsibility. Ambassador, let me tell you something about humans. We come from a world that has been trying to kill us since the day our species first stood upright. Ice ages that lasted for millennia. Volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun. Diseases that wiped out entire populations. Our planet taught us that survival requires two things: the ability to fight against impossible odds, and the wisdom to know when cooperation is more important than competition. She set down her coffee cup and turned to face Kelthera directly. Yes, we are violent. Yes, we are dangerous. But we are also the species that will cross half the galaxy to help people we've never met, simply because they asked for help. The same evolutionary pressure that made us effective warriors also made us protective of anything we consider to be under our care. Kelthera thought about the battle she had witnessed, the casual way human forces had dismantled an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. But the way you fought, I have never seen anything like it. You didn't just defeat the Void Swarm, you annihilated them. Your ships sacrificed themselves without hesitation. Your soldiers boarded enemy vessels knowing they might not return. Is this normal for humans? Chen smiled, and there was something both warm and terrifying in the expression. Ambassador, let me show you something. She activated the view screen, which shifted to show images from the recent battle. Kelthara watched as human ships charged. Directly into enemy formations, Marines launched themselves into space to board hostile vessels, and damaged ships rammed their opponents rather than retreat. Every human in that fleet, Chen said quietly, volunteered for this mission. When they learned that an entire civilization was facing extinction, 30,000 men and women stepped forward and said they were willing to die to prevent it. Not because they expected rewards or recognition, but because they believed it was the right thing to do. This level of self-sacrifice, Kelthara said slowly, it explains much about why other species fear you. A race that fights like this, that treats death in battle as acceptable casualties. What would happen if humans decided to expand their territory? What would happen if your species chose conquest over cooperation? Chen's expression grew serious. That's the question that keeps the Galactic Council awake at night, isn't it? What happens when the apex predators decide they want more than their small corner of space? She stood and walked to the view screen, looking out at the stars beyond. Zephyria Prime. The answer is simple, Ambassador. We don't expand because we don't need to. Earth and our colonies provide everything we require. But more importantly, we've learned something that most species never figure out. True strength comes not from conquering others, but from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. And if someone were to threaten Earth? Kelthara asked. If another species decided that humans were too dangerous to be allowed to exist? Chen turned back to her, and for a moment, the Zephyrian ambassador saw something in the human's eyes that made her understand why the Void Swarm had been destroyed. So completely. Then that species would learn what the Void Swarm learned, Chen said simply. That there are some things in the universe that should not be threatened. Earth is one of them. Our allies are another. She returned to her desk and pulled up a holographic display showing the local region of space. Ambassador, your people sent out a call for help, and we answered. That makes you our neighbors now, whether you want to be or not. Any species that threatens the Zephyrians in the future will find themselves dealing with the Terran Defense Forces. Kelthera stared at the display, realizing the implications of what Chen was saying. You're offering us protection, a formal alliance with humanity. I'm telling you that we've already made the decision, Chen corrected. The moment we jumped into this system and engaged the Void Swarm, the Zephyrians became part of Earth's sphere of influence. The only question now is whether you want to make it official. But what would you want in return? Kelthera asked. Your species has a reputation for being practical. Surely you don't offer military protection without expecting something back? Chen laughed, a sound that somehow managed to be both genuinely amused and slightly threatening. Ambassador, what could the Zephyrians possibly offer us that we couldn't take by force if we wanted it? Your agricultural technology? Your art? Your scientific knowledge? If we were the kind of species that took what we wanted from others, we would have done it already. She leaned back in her chair, her expression becoming more thoughtful. What we want from the Zephyrians is the same thing we want from all our allies: friendship, trade, and the knowledge that when we call for help, someone will answer. Humans have learned that the universe is a dangerous place, and it's better to face that danger with friends than alone. Kelthera was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she had heard. Finally, she spoke again. Admiral, there is one more question I must ask. The other species in the galaxy, when they learn what happened here, when they realize that humans are willing to cross interstellar distances to protect their allies, how will they react? Chen's smile returned, but this time it was the expression of a predator that had just realized it was surrounded by prey. Some of them will be grateful, she said. They'll realize that having humans as friends means they never have to worry about threats like the Void Swarm again. Others will be terrified because they'll understand that their own aggressive expansion plans just became much more complicated. She stood up, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. But all of them will learn the same lesson, Ambassador. The galaxy just became a much safer place for civilizations that believe in cooperation and mutual aid, and a much more dangerous place for anyone who thinks that might makes right. As Kelthera was escorted back to her shuttle, she reflected on everything she had learned. The humans had indeed saved her people, but they had also fundamentally changed the balance of power in the galaxy. The Void Swarm was gone, but in its place was something potentially even more transformative. A species that combined overwhelming military capability with a moral code that compelled them to protect the innocent. The galaxy was about to discover that sometimes salvation came with teeth, and that the most dangerous monsters could also be the most loyal